Hey everybody, this is Andy Melbuff, and in this video we're going to take a look at how we can create student feedback in Desmos Activity Builder. Now this particular video is going to focus on what we would call evaluative feedback. How do we tell students if they're correct or incorrect with a certain type of input? So let me just first distinguish between evaluative and interpretive feedback. Evaluative feedback is something that the teacher puts into the computation layer that gives the student some indication of whether they are correct or incorrect with their response. It can be very simple. For example, you can just put in here, you're correct or the answer is wrong. You can include emojis if you want to add a little bit more of a colorful response for them, but it can be that simple. You can make it a little bit more advanced where you might give them some feedback that an answer was incorrect and maybe a helpful hint follows that so that they can make a correction. And lastly, you can make it a little bit more sophisticated and you can include mathematical LaTeX notation in your feedback that's a little bit more sophisticated. But again, it's more feedback to tell the students, hey, this is something that's correct or incorrect. In a later video, we're going to look at interpretive feedback, which is basically the students inputting some sort of a response and visually seeing the results of those responses. And so you can see here that they might be prompted to predict a slope of a line, and then they get some visual feedback from that. And so they can make corrections based upon that visual feedback. They can also see in this a little bit more advanced version here, they can see how to plot an ordered pair and what their choice might look like visually on this particular screen. So what I want to do first is take you into Activity Builder, and I've got a sample screen set up here with a multiple choice question. What is the sum of angles in any triangle? So, and if a student responds with 90 degrees and they press submit, they can get this is very straightforward feedback. They basically get your answer is wrong. If they choose the correct response and submit, then they get a different piece of feedback on that. And the other incorrect responses also merit the same feedback as we saw before. So how do we build this into our slides in Activity Builder? Well, I'm going to leave the preview mode here. And I'm going to go to my next slide with basically the same note content here. And it's a multiple choice question. I've labeled it multiple choice 1, MC1, because I want to tie this input into the computation layer in this note here. So you can see here as I hover over this that the script, there's a little warning symbol, and that's because I left part of it out, and I'm going to show you how we build this. So I'm going to click into the computation layer script there, and I want to start with this. I usually use the word feedback as my variable for feedback. Now, you can use a single letter, you can use just several letters, you can use an entire word. And if you type in a word or a series of letters and you put equals after it, you're creating a variable. So right now I'm creating the variable feedback here. And what I'm going to do then is give that variable some conditions. And the way the conditions work is they always work top down. So what I want Activity Builder to do first is to check and see if the student entered the correct response. Well, the correct response came from multiple choice 1 as its component. So what I'm going to do here after the when is I'm going to type in MC, and as I start typing M, I'm prompted with the things I can put in after that. So I want MC1, and then I want its source to be is selected. So I'm going to choose is selected as its source because it's looking to pick out certain things chosen from MC1. And then after choosing that, in the parentheses, I want to know which one it chose. So I'm going to put in number 2 there. And what that indicates is my correct answer is the second choice in MC1. But besides that, I also want the students to press submit. I want them to commit to an answer and not just randomly click on things until they get correct feedback. So I'm going to add a second part to this condition. And at the same time, I want MC1 to be submitted by the students. So now I'm going to change my source here into submitted. And then after I choose that, I put in quotation marks what I want my feedback message to be. So what this will do is Activity Builder will start reading this top down, and it'll say, all right, is choice number 2 selected and has the submit button been pressed? If that's the case, this is the message students will see. Now, if that's not, if they don't choose option number 2, well, I want them to get some more feedback. So after the when, in my second part of this conditional, if the student chooses MC1 and submits it, then they'll get this message. This will only happen if the one above it does not happen. So if the student selects anything else other than option number 2 and presses submit, they'll get this message. And again, that's a very just simple piece of feedback. It doesn't really give them anything corrective. And then we always have to end these conditionals with otherwise. I can have several layers of whens in here, but I always have to have an otherwise. And the meaning of these double quotation marks after is if none of those conditions above are met, what's in the quotation marks will show up. Well, nothing's between them, so the students basically see nothing there. So now this feedback variable is all set. So I want to insert it into my note. And typically I will drop down 2 or 3 lines to where my cursor is right here. And then to insert the variable, I go to this little icon right here. I'm hovering over it where it says you can insert a value from Computation Layer. And here are the available variables that I've created. There's only one. I just click on that and it puts that little green box there. And now we're ready to see how this looks. So I'm going to go into preview mode. And if the student selects 90 degrees, which is an incorrect answer, by the way, nothing shows up yet until they press submit. Then there's the incorrect response feedback. If they change their answer to 180, again, nothing shows up. They haven't pressed submit. There's the correct response feedback. Now we're going to look at adding some feedback for a different type of slide where we have the student submitting something numeric. So this is an equation that's a fairly simple equation to solve for x, and we want to see if the student submits a correct answer or not. So let's say a student submits an answer of 10. I've still got my correct check in here from earlier. Once they press submit, here's some feedback. Now this feedback's a little bit more substantial than I had earlier. It gives them a suggestion to maybe adjust what they did and make a modification. So if the student subtracts 1 and divides by 4, they would end up with a response of 3 or an answer of 3 when they click submit. Now here's feedback. It can be as simple as some emojis. So I grabbed some green check marks there to put in, and you can see my correct check shows on the teacher dashboard they're correct. So how do we go ahead and build that? I'm going to close this out and I'm going to go to my next screen, which is basically a duplicate. I've got this note here. I've got a numeric input, and I want to label, or I want to name this math input, and you can label it as simple as input. And I'm going to go into the computation layer script here, and I'm going to start to build this. So I'm going to start with feedback again. I'm pretty basic with that. I just use that variable. Now I'm going to start my conditions. When input, now I'm looking not now for a selection because it's not multiple choice anymore. So input has some different sources available to me. I want to choose numeric value, and I want that numeric value to be equal to 3. That's the correct response right there. But I also want students, again, to have submitted, to make a commitment to that answer, not just type in random numbers until they get the right one. So I'm also going to add a second part to this, input dot submitted. Now, once that's done, here's what my message is going to be. I can simply put in text. I can copy and paste in emojis, whatever you'd like to do there. That's the first line or the first layer of my feedback. I also want students to get some feedback for something that's incorrect. So when input is submitted, in other words, they submitted anything other than the number 3, this is the feedback that will show up for them. I'm typing everything out that I did on the previous one, the hints that I used. Make sure you enclose the feedback part with quotation marks here. And then lastly, I'm still getting a warning symbol because it expects, well, it shows you right there, otherwise. So in my third line down, I'm going to type otherwise, double quotation marks. And now my feedback variable is ready to insert into the note. So I want to put my cursor where I want it to show up. I usually put a little space in there. I'm going to go to this icon. I'm going to insert the feedback, and let's see it in preview mode. If the student types in 7 and presses submit, there's the feedback. If they type in 3 and press submit, there's the other feedback, the correct feedback, if you will. Lastly, we can add evaluative feedback on slides that contain tables where students fill in particular cells. So this is one that we saw earlier where we ask students to input various values into the function to provide outputs. Well, what I want to first show you is what's in the script here. This is what we saw earlier. This is the correct check for the teacher dashboard. So we have 4 numbers that we're going to check. We want 4 values that the student inputs to be 5, 7, 9, and 11. Well, how do we also include some feedback for the students? Well, I'm going to click on this script here, and I'm going to call this feedback again, and then I'm going to have some conditions. Now, because I'm checking 4 different values, I'm kind of stack this in terms of our checks and how we put this in. Now, what I want to do first is make sure I label this component that I'm checking with. So I'm going to call it table. And then what I want to do is I want to check and see if the table component is the cell numeric value in row 1, column 2, going to be equal to 5. But that's not the only one I want to check. I have 3 other cells to check. So I'm going to have really one long conditional here that I'm going to split up into new lines. And it's much easier for me. I just do a lot of copy and paste and then adjust. So to check the second cell, that's going to be in row 2, column 2, and I want that to be equal to a 7. And in my third row of the table, it's going to be row 3, column 2. I want that to be a 9. And lastly, I want my fourth row, column 2, to be an 11. So there are the 4 things that I want to be considered to be correct. Now, if all of those are correct, and I don't want this extra and in here because I'm not connecting anything to it, if all of those are correct, I want my feedback to be nice job with some hands clapping. If this condition, and this is all one condition, if this condition is not met, then it goes to the otherwise. Now you'll notice here I don't have a submit option because this table doesn't have a submit button on it. We can add that, but it gets a little more sophisticated. So I'm going to keep my feedback here for the otherwise. At least one output box is incorrect. So I need to insert my feedback variable. And let's see it in preview mode. Now this is going to look a little different because right now the students see this piece of incorrect feedback. That's because we don't have a submit button on this. So right now they're going to see this, and they're going to see this feedback until all of these are correct responses. So if they start typing in and they type in a 5 and a 7 and a 9, they're on the right track, but they don't have all of them in there yet. So as soon as they type in 11 here, the feedback changes to the positive feedback we wanted. The teacher correct check shows up, and we're in business here. So that's just a quick introduction to adding a feedback variable into your note component so that students can get some evaluative feedback on their responses. Thanks.